All right, so this is Lecture 2, Part 2, dealing with the administration of John Adams. And we begin with the election of 1796. So in 1796, the United States of America is going to have to do something that it's never really had to do before, and that is choose a president. Obviously, we've had two presidential elections, but there really wasn't much of a choice, was there? George Washington was the obvious guy, and he had been elected unanimously in the Electoral College both times. And as long as Washington was the man running the country, really didn't feel the need to choose. But Washington has stepped aside now. He's retired back to Mount Vernon and the role of private citizen, and that means in 1796, the American people are actually going to have to select someone to be president of the United States. And not only is this going to be the first presidential election without George Washington on the ballot, it's also the first presidential election with the existence of political parties. The Federalist Party, which was the party in power, the party of Washington, the party of his Vice President Adams, the party of Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republican Party, which is led by Thomas Jefferson. And remember that the way the Constitution is originally structured, whoever got the most votes in the Electoral College becomes president. Whoever got the second most votes becomes the vice president. This is the way that the Constitution set things up. So in 1796, the Federalists decided that they wanted to hold on to both the presidency and the vice presidency, and therefore they nominated two candidates, John Adams, the sitting vice president, and Charles Pinckney, who was from South Carolina and a prominent politician. And the idea here is that Adams becomes president, Pinckney is the vice president. The Democratic Republicans, who are the party out of power, decide to put all their eggs in one basket, go for just the presidency, and therefore they nominated a single candidate, and that was the leader of their party, Thomas Jefferson. You'll notice that Alexander Hamilton is not on the list of candidates, even though he's been such an important and prominent figure. And the reason for that is that Hamilton and Adams were sort of, rivals for dominance in the Federalist Party, and Adams was able to keep Hamilton off to the side, and that's going to have consequences because when the election was held and the Electoral College met, Hamilton tried to get Federalist electors to vote for Pinckney instead of Adams, which led to a certain amount of confusion, helped split the Federalist Party, and the consequence of all of that was that John Adams got 71 electoral votes, and so he becomes the second president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson got 68 electoral votes, and Pinckney only got 59. And so Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the opposing party, becomes the vice president. So you have a Federalist president and you have a Democratic Republican vice president. And this sort of solidifies the stature of the vice presidency going forward, that it's a job that really doesn't have any power. The vice president is the presiding officer over the Senate when he chooses to be there. He can cast tie-breaking votes in the Senate when necessary, but otherwise his only true function is to wait around for something to happen to the president so he can take over. And vice president will have no more power than the president is willing to give him, and obviously Adams, being a Federalist, is unwilling to give very much power, very much responsibility to a Democratic Republican vice president known as Thomas Jefferson. So the election has been held. Adams has won. The Federalists have maintained control of the Congress, so they're still in charge of the government. The Democratic Republicans are still on the outside looking in. But this all happens in the context of the war that's still going on in Europe. And remember that the French are still very unhappy that we had not jumped into the war on their side against England, believing that we are violating the terms of that treaty of, quote, perpetual friendship and alliance that had been, signed in 1778. And the French had made it very clear that they had hoped that Jefferson was going to win the election of 1796 because, remember, the Democratic Republicans favor the French in the war that is going on in Europe. And the French were therefore unhappy that Adams had won, was going to continue the pro-English policies of George Washington. And as a consequence of that, the French say, all right, if you're not with us, you're against us. And they consider the United States basically as an ally of the English, and the French began to attack American ships doing business with England. And so suddenly we have the French attacking American vessels, doing the same thing that the British had done, and the American people reacted in the same way. They demanded war against the French. The flag's been fired upon, but Adams has the same problem that Washington had. The United States is neither militarily or financially in condition to go to war against anybody, even France, whose capacity for hurting the United States is a great deal less than that of England. And so Adams needed to find a way to calm tensions, to get the French to back off, to avoid a war we couldn't fight, and he turned to diplomacy just like George Washington had turned to diplomacy. And he sends 2 American ambassadors to France. One of them, the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, the other is Charles Pinckney, who doesn't get to be vice president, but does get to go to Paris, I guess as a consolation prize. And these 2 men go over with the intention of working up a treaty that will keep the U.S. out of war against the French. And instead, there occurs something called the XYZ affair. The XYZ affair. And basically, what happens in the XYZ affair is the American negotiators asked to meet with the French foreign minister. The French foreign minister, of course, isn't going to meet them initially. They're instead shown into an audience with 3 other French officials, the famous, or if you prefer, infamous X, Y, and Z in the story. And these French ministers tell the Americans that if they want to open negotiations, it will require an initial bribe of $250,000 and a loan of millions of dollars from the United States to help the French fight the English. Now, the reality is that in European diplomacy, this bribe to open negotiations was standard operating procedure, and any European diplomat would have understood it. But for the young and proud United States, this was a great outrage. The United States of America is not going to pay a bribe in order to conduct diplomatic business. And so Marshall proclaimed, no, not a sixpence. He and Pinckney got on a boat. They sailed home. They told the story, and quite unlike Jay's treatment when he came back having succeeded in obtaining a treaty that would avoid a war, Pinckney and Marshall were held as heroes for coming back without obtaining a treaty that would avoid a war. And so the XYZ affair, of course, angered the American people, and now it became impossible for the Adams administration to avoid war with France. So these are the people we have the treaty of, quote, perpetual friendship and alliance with, and now we are going to war against them. The result is a conflict known as the Quasi-War. The Quasi-War, and it's one of those unheralded wars in American history, but it's important because it establishes a number of precedents. First off, it's called quasi because it's a sort of kind of war, and it's a sort of kind of war because it was a war that was never declared by the United States Congress. The Constitution gives Congress the authority to declare a war, and only Congress can do that. But it also makes the president the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which means he can order them where he wants to send them and tell them to do what he wants them to do. And this is part of the balance of power, the checks and balances in the Constitution. What the quasi-war basically does is establish the reality that you can have a war that is not declared by Congress. Does that mean that Congress is abrogating its authority here? And the answer is no. Congress has discovered that it's kind of convenient to let the presidents bear the responsibility politically for waging war. And if the war goes well, then Congress can say, hey, we approved and supported all the time. And if it doesn't go well, they can say, hey, that's all on the president. That's not us. In fact, in its history, the United States has been engaged in more than 250 armed conflicts, most of them against Native Americans, but many of them smaller military confrontations overseas. And of these 250 plus military conflicts, only 5 of them have been wars declared by the United States Congress. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, the First World War, and the Second World War. Those are the only wars that have actually had congressional declarations of war. And there's convenience in not declaring war because it means stopping a war is a lot easier. It doesn't have to be a formal peace treaty or anything like that that has to get ratified. And so this is a lesson that the United States learns in the quasi-war. So it's quasi because it's not declared. But it's still authorized by Congress because Congress has to fund war. It has to buy the munitions. It has to pay the Army and the Navy. It has to build warships. It has to sign off on the promotion of officers who become generals or admirals in the Navy. And so as long as Congress is writing the checks, it's basically giving consent. It's approving the conflict even if it does not declare a state of war. It's quasi for another reason, and that is that it is a purely naval war. So armies never fight. This is a war carried on the high seas. It was a war that the United States was woefully unprepared for, as Adams, of course, knew. There were only 3 frigates, 3 ships in the entire United States Navy when the war began, and of course the French had hundreds of ships. So we established a tradition here. In peacetime, the United States, until at least the advent of the Cold War, maintains the minimum possible amount of military power. Then we get into a war, and that little bit of military power he has to hold the line while we quickly mobilize and we build up until we can fight and win the war. And then as soon as the war is over, we dispense with all of that wartime military power and go back to the bare minimum possible. So quasi-war establishes that precedent. We start with 3 ships. We quickly build up to 54 and 1,000 armed merchantmen, and we go out and we fight the French. Our Navy acquits itself very well. Of course, this makes us a de facto ally of England, the world's greatest naval power. Not necessarily a bad thing, but when the war comes to an end in 1800, we demobilize and we reduce the Navy to a mere 13 ships. So, and that's the way we're going to do things until after World War II. If anybody can be said to have won the war militarily, you probably can say that it was the United States. But that military success comes with a certain complication. And one of the complications is the fact that we didn't know there would be no land fighting. In fact, we were afraid that the French would invade. They had managed, after all, to get an army across the Atlantic Ocean in the face of the British Navy during our Revolution. And what there was of the small U.S. Army was out west fighting Indians. So we needed to have a second army to resist a French invasion. And the Adams administration began to put one together, being very careful to make sure that most of its officers were drawn from Federalist states so that it was an army that could be carefully controlled. It would not become a possible instrument of revolution, because one of the great fears of the Federalists under Adams was that Democratic Republicans would facilitate a French invasion of the United States. They would aid a French invasion of the United States in order to overthrow the Federalist regime and take power for themselves. This, of course, was a completely baseless fear, but it tells you something about how bad the political tensions are between the two parties. And so there's got to be a second American army to defend against a French invasion that we know is never going to happen. That army, of course, has to be commanded, and the only person that anybody can think of for commanding a new American army against a European invasion is, of course, George Washington. The country is never going to leave him alone. And so Adams gets in touch with Washington, and he asks him to take command of this new army. And Washington, who is, of course, always willing to do his duty, doesn't believe there's going to be a French invasion. And so he's not going to disrupt his life to go take command of an army yet again. And he basically tells Adams, look, the moment the first French soldier sets foot on American soil, I will take command of the army. Until then, I'm more than happy to kind of guide its development, but not be in day-to-day command. And Adams says, all right, that I'm willing to accept that. That's better than nothing. Who do you recommend should be in command of the army in your stead while it's training and drilling? And Washington says, well, I have someone I'm going to insist upon, and that is Alexander Hamilton. And you can kind of hear the gasp of horror coming from Adams, who's a rival with Hamilton for dominance in the Federalist Party. But Washington insists, and so Hamilton gets the job. And Hamilton actually does a good job in training and drilling and preparing the army. But then, of course, the French don't invade. And for Hamilton, this is kind of a disappointment. He's got this army. He'd like to use it. And he begins to talk out loud about maybe what we need to do is march across the Mississippi River and conquer the Spanish Southwest. And that terrifies Adams, who says, hey, one war at a time. And so that leads the Congress to divide the War Department. The War Department and now the Navy Department. So the Army's under the War Department, the Navy's under the Navy Department. Since the Navy's doing most of the fighting, then the Congress will pump funds toward the Navy, and the Army will get the bare minimum to make sure that Hamilton doesn't get into any mischief. So that division between Army and Navy in the government happens as a result of the quasi-war. So all of this is precedent setting. It's very interesting, but the real import of the quasi-war happens at home and politically. So remember, the Federalists are terrified that the Democratic Republicans are plotting revolution. They're terrified that they'll aid a French invasion. They're also, of course, becoming aware that as new states enter the Union west of the Appalachian Mountains, those tend to be dominated by the Democratic Republicans, who are therefore gaining political power in the Congress and the Electoral College. And so the Federalists under Adams attempt to deal with all of that by passing a series of laws that are collectively known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts, and these are passed in the summer of 1789, and they did things like make it more difficult for an immigrant to become a citizen, establishing a really long time before you could apply for citizenship. And of course, since most immigrants tend to become Democratic Republicans, what you're doing is, you're bottlenecking new Democratic Republican voters, and they basically, the Alien Sedition Acts are designed to harm and to muzzle the Democratic Republican Party, to shut it up. And here, the most important of these acts is the sedition law. And what the sedition law basically did was to define criticism of the government or its officials in the performance of their duties as criminal libel. Criminal libel. It would be a crime to criticize the government or its officers in the performance of their duties. And this was something Congress passed, something President Adams signed. It's something that the courts, which are staffed by Federalist judges appointed by a Federalist government, enforce. And something like 17 people are indicted under this law, and some of them are thrown into jail for up to 6 months at a time. And how often does that have to happen before the word spreads around? Be careful what you say and who you say it to and where you say it, or you might wind up in jail. And at the time, the Federalist portion of the country approved of this, because what the Democratic Republicans had been doing was criticizing the war, arguing that the war wasn't constitutional because it wasn't declared by Congress, and arguing that the war was unnecessary. We were fighting the wrong people. Why are we fighting the French instead of the English, who are our real enemy? It was a war that was being mismanaged by the government, so even though it's unconstitutional, it's unnecessary, it's being waged poorly and ineffectively. And the Federalists under Adams saw all of those complaints as basically treason, giving aid and comfort to the enemy in time of war, tearing down American morale, sowing doubt about our willingness to continue the struggle, undermining the armed forces. And here's a problem that you always have in a democracy in wartime. You have the freedom to criticize the government. That is criticizing the government in wartime really helping the war effort, or is it aiding the enemy's war effort? And this is a tension that will always exist in a democracy that is at war. And at the time, though, the Federalists were not disposed to see that as just part of the price of having a democratic form of government. And so they acted, and they acted in a way to try and shut the Democratic Republican Party up. Now, of course, one of the great problems with the Sedition Act in particular is that it violates the First Amendment to the Constitution, right? First Amendment of the Constitution that guarantees the freedom of speech. And even if that is speech that is critical of the government, and even if that's speech that's critical of the government in time of armed conflict. And if something like that were to happen today, then we would sue, right? Somebody would sue saying the government can't do this, this violates the Constitution, and in fact, in the case of the sedition law, the first court that heard it would agree and say, no, this violates the Bill of Rights, and they'd tear it up and they would throw it away. But what do you do when the courts are not willing to do that? And remember, nothing can go to the Supreme Court without working its way to the Supreme Court. It takes a long time to get there. And in the late 1790s, the Supreme Court, which is run by Federalists, might not have even agreed that this violates the Constitution. And so does that mean that the rights of the people can simply be rolled over by the federal government under the claim that, hey, this is wartime, we can do whatever is necessary? And the Democratic Republicans, of course, said no. But if they didn't have the power in Congress to undo the law, and they didn't have power in the courts to basically declare the laws unconstitutional, where was the defense of the people's rights going to come from? And the answer is it's going to come from the states. As the Democratic Republicans saw it, the states were the bulwark against federal tyranny, just like the colonial governments had been the bulwark against English tyranny in the lead up to the American Revolution. And so the response of the Democratic Republican Party to the Alien and Sedition Acts was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Now remember, a resolution is just an official statement by a legislative body, so it's not law, but it's a legislative body saying, we think X, we believe X. And the Virginia resolution was written by no less a person than James Madison, the author, basically, of the Constitution. The Kentucky resolution was written by Thomas Jefferson, who is the sitting vice president of the United States. And in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, both Madison and Jefferson say the same thing, and that is, it is the job of the states to protect the rights of the people against the unconstitutional acts of the federal government. That's as far as Madison in the Virginia resolution is willing to go. But Jefferson in the Kentucky resolution is willing to go further. Exactly how would you do that? And he says that there are two methods that a state can use to combat the unconstitutional actions of the federal government. And the first of these is nullification. That is, a state could declare a federal law null and void within its borders. The second is more extreme, and that is secession. And note the spelling of the word, S-E-C-E-S-S-I-O-N. And not succession, S-U-C-E-S, so on and so forth. Succession is one thing coming after another. Secession is a state leaving the Union. And if a state ceases to be part of the United States, then United States law, of course, no longer applies. Jefferson would tell you that these were extreme actions that should be taken only in extreme cases after every other political effort has been expended. But if it's a choice between the Union and preserving the rights of the citizens, then the rights of the citizens take precedence and the Union loses. And so Jefferson is the man who puts these words, nullification and secession, into American political discourse. And in the 1830s, the country will almost come apart over an argument about nullification, and in the 1860s, it will come apart over the question of secession, which will, of course, plunge it into a very bloody civil war. Was that going to happen over the Alien and Sedition Acts? And the answer is no, because in November of 1799, the quasi-war comes to an end. A new leader has emerged in France, Napoleon Bonaparte, who has taken control, and one of the great military geniuses of all time. He doesn't believe a sideshow war with the United States is in France's interest, and so in November of 1799, he releases the U.S. from our treaty of, quote, perpetual friendship and alliance, and American and French ships stop fighting each other. The quasi-war just sort of comes to an end. And because it comes to an end, the sedition law is allowed to expire. It had been passed with a 2-year time limit. That time limit expires. The Federalists under Adams do nothing to try and keep the law on the books. And with the end of the sedition law, then there is no justification for nullification or secession. But the words are there, the concept is out there, and people differ on whether or not they are valid political instruments, constitutional political instruments, but until those questions are pushed to the limit, there won't be a decision. And for the moment, you don't know what would have happened if they had been used. Would the federal government allow states to, in essence, pick and choose which federal laws it wants to accept? If that was the case, what good is the Union? You're back to the days of the Articles of Confederation. Would the federal government allow a state to leave the Union? And if a state wanted to do it, would the federal government resort to military force to prevent that state from leaving the Union? Would it be willing to have a civil war to keep a state from leaving the Union? We don't know. We don't know in 1800 because the crisis was not reached, but the ideas are out there now, and having been put out there now, they are never going to go away, and that stows up great problem for the Union in the future. But for the moment, the quasi-war has ended. The U.S. can be said to have won it, if anybody can be said to have actually won it, and the Adams administration has therefore kind of won a war, but it's still on very, very shaky terms. John Adams has one very serious problem that he's never going to be able to overcome, and that is he's living in the shadow of George Washington. George Washington was tall, rugged, handsome. John Adams is short, pudgy, and sort of aristocratic. George Washington's a war hero. Adams is a statesman and a politician. George Washington had a talent for picking good people to be in his administration. John Adams doesn't necessarily have that talent. And John Adams has waged a questionable war in an era of political parties, and none of that is going to accrue to his benefit. But the biggest problem that he has is that, everybody's comparing him as the second president to George Washington as the first president. And who could live up to that comparison? It's inevitable that Adams is going to come off as something of a disappointment. He was a hard guy to like. He was a hard guy to get along with. None of that is going to do him any favors, and that means as we head into the next presidential election in 1800, Adams is a vulnerable incumbent facing a resurgent Democratic-Republican Party under Thomas Jefferson that is gaining ground with the admission of new states, Kentucky and Tennessee, into the Union, and chomping at the bit to finally gain something that the Democratic Republicans have never had, and that is control of the government and actual political power. And so that ends the second part of lecture number 2 on the Adams administration. And so now time for your questions. So true or false, John Adams had a vice president who was loyal to a political party other than his own. True or false, John Adams had a vice president who belonged to a political party that was not the party of the president. Question number 2, the quasi-war was fought against which country? Which country did we fight the quasi-war against? Question number 3, true or false, Congress declared war on France at the start of the quasi-war. True or false, Congress declared war on France at the start of the quasi-war. Question number 4, the sedition law was designed to do what? What did the sedition law declare to be illegal? And then finally, question number 5, the Adams administration tried to avoid a war with France, but that effort failed because of what event? The Adams administration tried to avoid a war with France, but that attempt failed because of what event? So send me over the answers to those questions, and then look for part 3 of lecture number 2 when we talk about the administration of Thomas Jefferson.